in different movies, like even what women went through for the right to vote. And I want to thank the League of Women Voters and E-News and Carmelina and Addie from the Triangle Fire Coalition and everybody, because we shouldn't take those struggles for granted. I mean, women were beaten and died for these rights that we enjoy today, and it's a good time to really remember those sacrifices, including the sacrifice of those 146 women.
This is a picture of the Women's Trade Union League. This was the group of women that, you know, got together in that part of the early part of the 20th century, and you know, they tried to get women organized. You know, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and of the 146 victims, 129 of them were women. So it was and if you go back even further to the uprising of the 20,000, which was a walkout of 20,000 garment workers, it was a strike which was basically a women's walkout. I don't know that they were the only factory that didn't settle the strike, but they were one of the largest garment manufacturers in the city at the time. So they were able to withstand the pressure to let the unions in. Many of the other shops settled with the union, and the growth of the union after the uprising of the 20,000 was quite dramatic. After the fire, it was sort of exponential.
They weren't represented by it.
They weren't represented. They were union members in the Triangle shop. Women who joined the union, but it wasn't a union shop. They didn't have the right to bargain collectively with the owners of the shop and advocate for such things as fire safety equipment. As you might understand, might not be aware, fire sprinklers were available in 1911. They were the first workable fire sprinkler was invented in, I think, 1872. But the owners of the factory thought it was a much better deal to buy lots of fire insurance rather than to install a sprinkler system or to train their workers what to do in the event of a fire. So it would have taken time away from manufacturing garments. What you see here is where some of the bodies, some of the women and men who jumped from the 9th floor fell straight through these glass bricks. There's another story, and we don't have pictures of that in the book, but in the back of the building there was in fact a fire escape, and there's pictures later in the book that show the fire escape. I'll talk about those later. But the fire escape was so shoddily made and passed an inspection, you know, for whatever reason, that collapsed. And the women and men who tried to escape through the fire escape fell to their deaths through a similar skylight that was protected by an iron picket fence. So several of the victims were impaled on the iron picket fence. Horrific stuff, horrific stuff.
All right, so now the next photograph you were interested in is the trade parade. Okay, as I said, the bodies of the 7 unidentified victims were not released to the unions, even though the families that were looking for their lost loved ones agreed that the unions could take them, but the city was afraid of a riot. So the city kept the bodies and took them to Evergreen Cemetery. I believe it was April 5th, 1911. So that's, you know, 10 days after. Okay, 11 days. Anyway, so the unions pulled together and had what's called a trade parade. And it was a mourning parade. It was a funeral procession. I'm going to show you one other picture that leads to that, and that is this particular, call for the workers to assemble and watch the newspapers for how they're going to march. But essentially the unions, about 60 unions got together, and they handed out these handbills across the city. Some priests allowed them to be handed out outside of Mass. Synagogues were, you know, places of distribution. And if you notice, it's in English, Yiddish, and Italian, so that the workers came out on April 5th to participate in this trade parade. Now, this picture is our cover picture. Okay, it's the same picture as on the cover of the book, and there was this horse-drawn hearse with, you know, draped horses and an empty coffin. Okay, it was a symbolic empty coffin because, as I said, the city would not release the unidentified bodies. So they followed an empty coffin. There were over 100,000 marchers in the trade parade, and over 400,000 people lined the streets.
The conditions were not safe. There were no evacuation procedures. The hours were long, and the toil was incredibly arduous. And on top of all of this, they couldn't even escape when a fire had broke out in their building. And how this relates to the modern world is that it's a reminder of who it was that had to be sacrificed in order for us to gain the rights that we have today, in order for us to have workplace safety regulations, everything from child labor laws to OSHA to any number of other legal protections for people who are working. But while we may take that for granted in the United States, there are two things that always have to be remembered. Those regulations are under attack in this country. We still have to fight for them. Trade unions are still on the back foot in attempting to protect workers. And around the world, we find there are still countless sweatshops, countless factories that are operating in countries precisely because they lack these labor laws, where people are suffering and dying because they are not protected by the regulations that came about as a result of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire.